The pen slid across the counter toward me, pushed firmly by my daughter, Laura. "Just sign it, Mom," she said, her voice sweet but sharp underneath. Behind me, her husband, Mark, pressed his hand into my shoulder. Not a gentle squeeze, but one that dug in deep, a quiet threat disguised as support. I smiled faintly, though my pulse hammered against my ribs. My fingers shook slightly as I slid a folded scrap of paper across to the teller instead of reaching for the pen. On it, I had scrawled, "Help." This isn't my choice. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. The sterile hum of the printer, the flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead, even Laura's performative grin for the bank cameras. All of it faded. Only one thing mattered, whether the teller would understand. The paper disappeared into the hands of the branch manager, Angela Ruiz. She read it carefully, her eyes hardening before meeting mine. She didn't speak, but the subtle nod told me she had heard me loud and clear. Seconds later, the heavy glass doors clicked shut, locking from the inside. Everything shifted in that instant. If you're wondering how a grandmother ended up sending secret pleas for help in a public bank, the story begins months earlier. Back then, I was simply Vera Hudson, 68 years old, a widow living peacefully in Seattle. My days were filled with gardening, book club gatherings, and weekly calls with friends who looked out for one another. I believed my daughter loved me, that my son-in-law respected me. I believed I was safe. I was wrong. It hadn't started with aggression or shouting. No, it began with small gestures, the kind that masqueraded as care, overly concerned phone calls, frequent visits with plastic smiles, questions that sounded like love but felt like surveillance. At first, I brushed it off. A daughter worrying over her mother. What harm was there in that? But the pieces added up slowly, tightening around me like invisible threads until I realized I was no longer free. What they called guidance was really control, and I, trusting, had let them tighten the noose without even realizing it. Looking back now, the warning signs had been there from the very start. Laura's voice on the phone, syrupy sweet. "Mom, are you eating enough? Did you sleep? Aren't you lonely in that big house?" The words wrapped in concern, but the undertone was sharp, like she was gathering evidence against me. Then came the visits. Laura and Mark would arrive with takeout, smiling wide, but their eyes wandered my home as though they were assessing a property, not visiting family. Mark especially had a way of moving through my house like an inspector on assignment. He'd pull out his phone, typing notes about my medications, loose rugs, the step stool in the pantry. He shook his head with every observation, not like a caring son-in-law, but like a man documenting weakness. One night after dinner, Laura reached across the table, patting my hand as if I were fragile glass. "Mom, we just want what's best for you." Her words stung deeper than she knew. They didn't sound like comfort. They sounded like a verdict. After that night, I couldn't stop replaying Laura's words. "We just want what's best for you." They echoed in my head, not like reassurance, but like a cage snapping shut. Soon every conversation with them circled back to the same theme, my supposed fragility. Laura scrutinized my daily routines. Mark questioned my finances. Even small details, like how I stored groceries, were treated like proof that I was slipping. One evening, Mark held up a jar of peanut butter, tapping the expiration date with exaggerated disapproval. "You could have made yourself sick, Vera," he said, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. I had managed an entire household for decades, balancing bills, filing taxes, even keeping my late husband's contracting business afloat. And yet, here they were, treating me like I couldn't be trusted with a pantry. That's how control begins. Not with fists or shouting, but with subtle nudges, constant suggestions, and a steady drip of doubt. Hear it enough, and even the strongest part of you starts to wonder, what if they're right? By the second month, I felt less like their mother and more like a patient under observation. Their smiles seemed staged, their hugs rushed, like affection was just another box to check off. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep inside, something whispered that I wasn't. The red flags became clearer. It started with a phone call. "Mom, you forgot Tommy's baseball game," Laura scolded. But I hadn't. I remembered pruning roses in my backyard that weekend. No one had ever told me about a game. Still, the way she said it, heavy with disappointment, made me feel as though I'd failed some unspoken test. A few days later, I found my pill organizer scrambled. Tuesday's compartments were filled with Friday's doses, vitamins mixed with blood pressure medication. My chest tightened as I stared at it. Had I really made such a dangerous mistake? When I asked Laura, she pressed her lips together like she was holding back judgment. "Mom, this is exactly what we've been worried about." What if you overdosed? That night, I barely slept. I checked my bills, scanned my neat checkbook, opened drawers to see everything in its place. I knew I wasn't confused, and yet her words replayed. What if you had overdosed? Mark's tactics were even more methodical. He began bringing me articles printed off the internet, stories of seniors tricked by scammers, charts about falls at home, studies on memory decline. "I'm not saying this will happen to you, Vera," he said, using my full name like a lecturer addressing a student. "But the statistics speak for themselves." I wanted to shout that I was still the same woman who once balanced payrolls, tax forms, and contracts without missing a beat. But instead, I bit my tongue because I realized something chilling. They weren't trying to help. They were building a case. This wasn't love. This was gaslighting, drop by drop, eroding my confidence until I questioned reality itself. But deep inside, a stubborn ember refused to die. Each time Laura sighed in false concern, or Mark handed me another grim statistic, a small voice inside me whispered, "You are not the one losing control here. They are." The turning point came on a warm Saturday morning when Laura and Mark invited me over for brunch. They were unusually cheerful, their voices a little too bright, like stage actors pretending at happiness. I should have known then that something was brewing. We sat around the table, Laura pouring orange juice, Mark unfolding papers from a neat leather folder. The smell of cinnamon rolls wafted through the room, but my stomach knotted too tightly to enjoy it. Laura reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. "Mom, we've been thinking a lot about your future. You deserve to feel safe and supported, without all the daily stress." Mark cleared his throat, sliding one of the papers toward me. "It's just some information. Completely voluntary, a power of attorney, nothing complicated. It just means if you ever need help, we'll be able to step in, protect you, you know?" The words power of attorney blared like a siren in my head. I glanced at the neat columns of text, legal jargon twisting across the page. My pulse thudded in my ears. I looked at them. Their eager faces, their carefully rehearsed concern, and something inside me cracked. For weeks, they had been planting seeds of doubt. For weeks, I had been wondering if I was slipping, if maybe I really couldn't trust myself. And now, here was the harvest, a signature that would hand them the keys to my entire life. I pushed the paper back toward Mark. "I don't need this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Laura frowned, her lips thinning into a sharp line. "Mom, don't be stubborn. We're just trying to help. Do you want to end up like Mrs. Halverson down the street? She fell, broke her hip, and her son had to scramble through piles of unpaid bills. You don't want that, do you?" Her tone was soft, but the message was sharp. "Sign this, or you're reckless." I folded my hands in my lap, anchoring them to stop their trembling. I've paid every bill on time for 40 years. I don't need anyone to manage my life. Mark sighed as though I were a child refusing medicine. "We'll leave it here just in case you change your mind." That night, alone in my house, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the copy of the papers they had slipped into my purse. My reflection wavered in the darkened window above the sink. For the first time, I said the truth out loud. They don't trust me. They want control. Saying it made weight in my chest both heavier and clearer. This wasn't just overprotectiveness. This was a plan. I thought back to the misplaced pills, the phantom baseball game, the endless articles about senior decline. Each memory clicked together like puzzle pieces until the picture was undeniable. I wasn't imagining it. They were building a story, a narrative where I was fragile, forgetful, and unfit. But here's the thing they underestimated. I may have been shaken, but I wasn't broken. The ember inside me still glowed. And that night, as I tucked the legal papers into a drawer instead of signing them, that ember sparked into something stronger. Resolve. If they were preparing for a battle over my independence, they were about to learn that I was not surrendering quietly. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The fog of their whispers, their carefully planted doubts, began to lift. For too long, I'd been reacting to Laura and Mark's narrative. Now I decided it was time to write my own. I started with the basics. Proof. I pulled out my checkbook, bank statements, and utility bills, spreading them across the dining room table. Line by line, I went through each record. Every bill paid on time, every transaction neat and orderly. I created a binder, tabbed and dated, a quiet shield against any accusations of incompetence. Then I tackled the so-called mistakes. The pill organizer? I bought a new one, this time with a locking lid. If anyone tampered with it again, I would know. The forgotten baseball game? I bought a calendar and wrote down every event in ink. If Laura claimed I'd missed something, I'd have the evidence to prove otherwise. As I worked, I felt a steady strength building. They had underestimated me. They thought age dulled memory and willpower, but they had forgotten. I was the woman who once balanced a household budget to the penny while raising 2 children and keeping my husband's business afloat. I wasn't fragile. I was prepared. The true test came a week later. Laura showed up unannounced, a smile too sweet plastered across her face. "Mom, I thought I'd help you sort through your mail," she chirped, already reaching for the stack on the counter. I slid the binder toward her instead. "Already done," I said coolly. Her smile faltered. "Oh, well, that's good. But what about your medication? You didn't forget, did you?" I opened the locked organizer, each compartment perfectly in order. "No mistakes," I replied. For the first time, Laura didn't look concerned. She looked irritated, and in that flicker of her expression, I saw the truth plain as day. This wasn't about love, it was about control slipping through her fingers. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, thinking about my next step. Defending myself wasn't enough. If they were willing to push this far, I needed someone on my side who understood the law. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with an elder law attorney, quietly without telling Laura or Mark. Sitting across from the lawyer, I explained everything. The misplaced pills, the guilt trips, the pressure to sign over power of attorney. He listened carefully, nodding. "You're right to be cautious. Unfortunately, situations like this happen more often than people realize. The best thing you can do is get ahead of it." Together, we updated my will, secured my financial accounts with stronger protections, and created a medical directive that required my explicit consent for any decision. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When I walked out of his office, the air felt sharper, freer. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for their next move. I was preparing mine. As the sun set that evening, I looked around my quiet home. It was the same house Laura and Mark had tried to convince me I couldn't handle. But now it felt different. Not a cage, not a battleground, but a fortress. And I was no longer just defending it. I was ready to fight. It didn't take long for Laura and Mark to sense the shift. I wasn't the same shaky, uncertain mother they'd been circling for months. My answers came sharper, my routines tighter, and the little traps they'd set no longer worked. The first sign came during Sunday dinner at Laura's house. She passed me a plate and asked in that syrupy voice, "Mom, did you remember to take your blood pressure pill tonight?" I smiled, pulling a small notebook from my purse. Yes, at 6:30. I wrote it down, as I do every day. The notebook wasn't necessary. I remembered perfectly well, but it was a prop, proof against her doubts. Laura's jaw tightened as she refilled her glass of wine. Mark tried next. Mom, I heard a scammer's been calling around the neighborhood. Did you get any strange phone calls? You've got to be careful. These people prey on the elderly. I met his eyes steadily. I've already signed up for call blocking with the phone company. Haven't had a single spam call since. The silence that followed was thick. For the first time, they looked cornered, like chess players realizing the board wasn't in their favor anymore. But they didn't back down. They adapted. 2 days later, Laura showed up at my house again, this time with a casserole dish and an air of manufactured cheer. I just thought you might want company, she said, stepping in before I could answer. She glanced around my living room, her eyes darting to the tidy stacks of paperwork, the organized shelves, the neat rows of labeled pill bottles. Her smile faltered. You've been busy, she said flatly. Yes, I replied, folding my hands. I like to keep things in order. That was when she dropped the sweetness. Mom, this isn't healthy. Obsessing over binders and checklists, it's not normal. Mark and I are just trying to help, but you're making it harder. For a moment, I almost laughed. The audacity of it, the very evidence of my competence twisted into proof of instability. I leaned back in my chair, meeting her gaze. Laura, I've managed my life for over 60 years. I don't need a babysitter. Her eyes hardened. We'll see. Those 3 words stuck with me long after she left. I knew then that this wasn't over. They weren't going to simply accept my refusal. If anything, their frustration meant they might escalate. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. I began documenting everything. Dates, conversations, even small incidents that felt off. I stored copies of important documents in a safe deposit box at the bank, beyond their reach. I even told my attorney what Laura had said. We'll see. He nodded gravely, assuring me I'd taken the right steps. The more they pushed, the stronger my resolve grew. They thought of me as weak, easy to manipulate. But what they didn't realize was that every attempt to undermine me only sharpened my determination. By the end of that week, something remarkable happened inside me. For months, I had felt like prey, waiting for the next snare to close around me. But now, the roles were shifting. Laura and Mark were circling, yes, but I was no longer vulnerable. I was watching, preparing, and planning. And soon it would be their turn to feel cornered.